Good evening, everyone, and welcome to York Festival of Ideas. My name is Lorraine Farrelly, and I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. Thank you for joining us. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Bruno Carvalho. Bruno is professor at Harvard University, where he teaches courses on cities. He is the author of Porous City, A Cultural History of Rio de Janeiro, and has recently brought out The Invention of the Future. He has approached his work from an interdisciplinary perspective, which mixes history, urban design, social sciences, and many more themes to bring us his regular research and his research in author capacity. For The Invention of the Future, Bruno tells the story of key moments and turning points: the rebuilding of Lisbon after the 1755 earthquake, the 1811 Commissioner's Plan for Manhattan, and the utopian capital of Brasília. In recent decades, Carvalho argues the capacity to invent urban futures has become increasingly constrained. Social and environmental challenges loom large, but the story is not over. Bruno, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm especially grateful to Professor Lorraine Farrelly for that lovely introduction and for joining this session. And I'm very grateful to the festival organizers as well. So my presentation draws largely from my recent book, The Invention of the Future. The book is out. I hope some of you will pick up a copy, so I won't summarize it. Instead, I'll try to give a sense of some key arguments, walking you through several of the book's 60 plus illustrations. I'll say a bit about how the futures of the past can be relevant for us today, and we'll end with a reflection that comes out of the many conversations I've had with readers since its publication. But first, let's open with an exercise. So try to imagine being sent back in time to the beginning of our century and telling people that Donald Trump would be a two-term US president. Try the same with Brexit or with Bolsonaro in my native Brazil, or imagine going back to early 1780s Paris or early 1900s Mexico City when impending revolutions did not appear on the horizon. I think you get my point. In modern history, the person who returns in a time machine with knowledge of what's to come would almost always be laughed out of a room of very serious people. For the past couple of centuries, reasonable expectations have tended to underestimate the range of potential outcomes. This is an important lesson today. Even as increasingly sophisticated computational tools improve our predictive capacities, models necessarily, by definition, work from existing data and precedents. The future, however, remains in the realm of unknown unknowns. History reminds us of that over and over. History cautions us against fantasies of finality, closure, salvation, or permanent solutions. This is not a knock on expertise. It is not meant as an argument against attempts to predict or plan, but rather as a reminder that we should never assume that any given prospect is inevitable. Whether in history or in our personal lives, what we get is often not what we can see coming. When I was a kid in Rio, it was not in the cards for me to one day become a book author and a speaker at the York Festival of Ideas, and yet here we are. I assume most of you have examples from your own lives. In 1848, a magazine in Vienna expressed a sentiment that would become widespread and intuitive. What was scarcely conceivable yesterday is reality today and history tomorrow. Amid the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, this quote meant to evoke political volatility, but it could also apply to the experience of urbanization. The title of my book refers to a change that took place in 18th century Europe. Increasingly, people became able to imagine futures that would be very different from the present and the past. The future was no longer to be mostly shaped by divine forces. It was to be built by humans here on Earth. The book tells the story of modern cities as expressions of that idea. It is a story of dreams fulfilled, surpassed, deferred, frustrated, and sometimes turned nightmarish. I open, as Lorraine mentioned, with the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon and the reconstruction of the Portuguese capital. So here you have the modern grid plan with the early medieval layout underneath. The new constructions, which you can still see in the city's central area, the Baixa, incorporated some of the latest scientific knowledge in sanitation and anti-seismic design. The main square, which you see there towards the bottom, was not dedicated to a royal palace or a cathedral, as has been conventional, but rather to commerce. It was unfathomable that an earthquake would create conditions for a rational and secular city plan in a kingdom steeped in religion, and yet that's what happened. Since then, our ability to foresee has largely not been able to keep up with developments, but our ideas about the future have never stopped shaping how we experience the present, how we tell stories about the past, and how we set off to build or rebuild our cities. In the 1750s, the modern plan for Lisbon was led by a state minister who became known as Pombal. He had spent time in Vienna and London. He would earn a reputation as an enlightened despot. Here we have a painting illustrating a new narrative, the master planner supplanting divine will. Behind Pombal, to the viewer's left, we see a model of an equestrian statue of the king surrounded by allegories of commerce, arts, and industry, three pillars of modern planning. His right arm rests on plans for the new Lisbon. Drawings of buildings spread out on the floor and on a stool suggest a pragmatic visionary at work. He is positioned on a perch, sitting in an imaginary building with marble floors and classical columns removed from the hustle bustle below. The image of the masculine planner above the city would have a long tradition in urban discourse. If we read this painting from left to right, as we tend to in alphabetic cultures, the dark, ominous clouds give way to enlightenment, as if responding to Pombal's actions. His left hand gestures towards the horizon, where the Tagus River meets the Atlantic, suggesting bright possibilities ahead. The busy port and the colonies beyond evoke the transatlantic connections that funded Lisbon's rebuilding. The plans project the modern values of the Portuguese Empire. The painting's three planes tell a related story. Each has a distinct logic in space and time. In the background, beyond the river, we imagine the wayward oceans. In the middle ground, the built environment that withstood the earthquake in grandiose Renaissance style. In the foreground, the linear efficiency of the planned city, brought into being by the powerful statesman. The past, the present, the future. This was a painting supremely confident about its place in posterity, and in a matter of decades, its style became dated and obsolete. Even as urban planning experienced turning points, the experience of time for most people was marked by natural cycles and faith. Seasons, religious festivals, and living beings came and went. Whether in the city or countryside, planning depended on new relationships to time and space as categories fixed through political boundaries and property rights. Here we can see both the United States and Manhattan advancing toward rectilinearity over time, in this case from right to left. Rather than rivers and terrain dictating borders, we increasingly have straight lines imposed from above. That's the direction we are headed. The book moves to the plan you have here from that other newer York from the early 1800s. This is a radically open-ended grid, which does not assign functions to specific places, partly because the planners never expected that New York would fill up as quickly as it did. Unintentionally, the bare-bones grid proved very adaptable to the city's rapid growth. Around then, movements to expand rights proliferated, including abolitionism. The ability to imagine new futures increasingly became a more bottom-up affair. People migrated to the booming cities of the North Atlantic in pursuit of better lives. Often they sought to escape constraints based on gender, race, trade, religion, etc. In this period, mass-produced clothing helped to unsettle hierarchies. Now, a man dressed like a gentleman might be a crook. And then in comes in popular fiction, which could act as manuals, cautionary tales, or mirrors to the aspirations and anxieties of urban dwellers. I say much more about literature and the experience of changing cities in the book. For now, I'll move on to another image, this futuristic London. London became the first city in Western Europe since ancient Rome to have more than 1 million inhabitants. By the late 1820s, it was the largest in the world. Perhaps because London leapt ahead earlier, its culture reflected unease with the march of progress. Some people began to ask where this was all going. In this satirical engraving, the British artist William Heath mocked technological innovations that overlooked basic needs. In his vision, we have multimodal streets with raised sidewalks segregating speeds, very modern. A well-dressed man driving a carriage reads the Times. In the 1810s, this London newspaper pioneered the steam-powered rotary press, leading to much higher circulations. The city was teeming with inventions, sped up or stuck, rich and poor, all caught up in the mix. At the same time, all four readers you see in this scene seem oblivious to the action around them, which includes a child falling on the road, raggedy street performers, and soot-faced chimney sweepers. Meanwhile, two extravagantly dressed women peer into a modern shop window with comically large hats. The future was already not evenly distributed. From an economic perspective, London showed the power of agglomeration effects spurring productivity. In this humorous depiction, these intermingling activities and inventions promised a future where class inequalities and chaos would rule the streets. New technologies served futile or destructive ends. A contraption moves people to the top floor of a building. Up above, a balloon ship engages in battle. Other vehicles are propelled by birds, kites, steam engines. The background expands the scene to infrastructure and geopolitics. We see a bridge connecting Dover in England to Calais in France, and a balloon hovers with an early flag for the fledgling United States. Another futuristic etching, also by Heath, was titled March of Intellect, a recurrent phrase to celebrate or criticize progress. Here, Heath made the connection to colonization and ridiculed technologies of rapid transit even more forcefully. He showed a pneumatic grand vacuum tube with direct service to Bengal. If anyone doubted whether they were supposed to admire or fear these visions, the caption at the top drips with sarcasm. Lord, how this world improves as we get older. Amid prescient themes, there was a conspicuous absence. This vision misses the actual next big thing, trains. With steel and steam technologies, the speed of innovations in mobility, construction, and communications took off, stretching the limits of the thinkable and the buildable. The past could no longer serve as a yardstick for what seemed possible, and yet this period is full of reformists, reactionaries, revolutionaries, and everyday people who thought that progress could be achieved and that change can be managed. As competing visions multiplied, urban planners often became arbiters and producers of futures. The book then turns to Paris, where under Napoleon III in the mid-1800s, the Baron Haussmann led a set of reforms that rendered the French capital as we came to know it. Paris provided a model and image of the future for cities throughout the globe. Its plan was less open-ended than Manhattan's had been. It was very much a response to changes brought by railroads. Train stations played a key role. In the 19th century, railways and steamers revolutionized transportation between cities, but within cities, mobility advances were not quite as dramatic. Nonetheless, we get images like this. In the early 20th century, automobiles and airplanes would open new possibilities. A vertical imagination often assumed that flight would be ubiquitous in urban settings. Here we have Paris in the early 1900s, imagined in the year 2000. The Eiffel Tower gives away the setting. You can see it in the background below. The urban fabric hasn't changed too drastically here, nor at first glance have cultural tastes. These people are on the way to the opera. But we have, of course, flying vehicles. In some senses, futuristic visual media was less engaged in predicting futures in transit and more trying to catch up to the actual floor-shattering developments of the period. Detail from this was in an alternative cover for my book, which you see here. And here we have the city as spectacle, urban imagination as both spectacle and structure, spectacle as satire, fashion, flight, bright lights, but more meets the eye. We see a guard bearing swords, women driving, gazes unsettled. Around the same time, another French illustrator made a series of cards for cigarette cases titled also in the year 2000. From our vantage point, the scenes range from prescient to silly. In one, people ride on submarine buses. In another, they have an underwater croquet party. An electric train connects Paris and Beijing. Gender roles, as they often did in early science fiction futures, remain the same. And in backgrounds, the architectural styles resemble the contemporary city after Osmanian reforms. This one depicts an aero cab station. Despite an elevator and steel frames, no skyscrapers yet. Flying vehicles take to the sky, but on the ground, familiar media dominates. Spacious sidewalks, car-free and dog-filled streets, storefronts, kiosks selling newspapers. After an inflection point, people tended to expect innovations ascending in a steep line rather than plateauing. With balloons, zeppelins, and early airplanes, it seemed logical to assume all sorts of other flying vehicles were on the immediate horizon. Flying around the city became a constant feature of imagined vertical densification. At the same time, it was nearly impossible to conceive of leaps in transportation technologies without mass transit remaining central. Collective vehicles had an edge over automobiles. The book's second half largely turns to the Southern Hemisphere. We focus on Rio after drastic reforms aimed at Parisianizing the Brazilian capital. They did not see the car coming, and planning for drivers would enable a degree of segregation that even the most prejudiced 19th century planners could not have dreamed of. As we advance toward the interwar period, readers will find the usual suspects like Le Corbusier and Henry Ford, but they will also find Buenos Aires as a crossroads for urban cultures and a place where planners had an unusual grasp of the importance of thinking at the metropolitan scale as cities boomed. We move from the victory of the car and how it foreclosed many other urban futures to the rapid growth of self-built cities with a particular focus on Lagos. The pursuit of urban futures shifts towards the Pacific world, increasingly to East Asia. And as we get closer to the present, these histories remain linked, but there are real limits to what we can learn from precedents, given the scales of urbanization today. Contemporary Lagos has 2 to 3 times as many inhabitants as the United States, the entire United States had when the Manhattan Grid was laid out. So we draw lessons from history at our own peril. These are images, screenshots from the book, by the way. So in the epilogue, I have a title with a double meaning: Pedestrian Futures. It returns to a question that opens the book, where did the future go, and ends by trying to answer, where can the future go? There is an arc in the past 3 centuries toward confidence in the human ability to shape the built environment. The future was to be pursued, and then increasingly around a century ago, with First World War as an inflection point, the future was also to be prevented. Climate change has intensified this sentiment. Utopias lose appeal, dystopias emerge. Illusions of history as predictable came under great stress after the 1968 uprisings and the 1970s oil crises. Once again, fantasies of stability and control cannot survive contact with reality, and the future came under attack. In the 1970s, the French Algerian economist Georges Elgozi criticized the pretenses of technocrats. The future was a bluff. Tomorrow would not take place. The Sex Pistols voiced the punk distrust of institutional promises with the slogan, "No future." In Brazil, the author Clarice Lispector wrote about the new capital, quote, "Brasília is a future that happened in the past." A local band would sing of how the future is no longer what it was before. At the same time, into the 1980s, for every expression of disillusionment or alarm, many more future peddlers arose. The future became bigger business. Forecasting permeated the public and private sectors. By then, urban designers and planners had largely lost political relevance. They were overwhelmed by the victory of car-centric urbanization, perhaps the most profound development for both planning and the environment. Globalization, capitalism, and state-led development all maintained symbiotic relationships with oil-based production and automotive industries, and these would outlast any other illusion of linear progress. That is largely where the future went. Across the globe, in the 1990s, the wealthier residents of even the poorest cities gained greater access to global belonging. Cable TV, international travel, imported goods. Many moved to gated condos. Technologies mediated their relationships to globalization, while the car mediated their relationships to immediate environments. Rather than the creation of new collective futures, the emergent dream was to buy into a prosperous world that already existed, driving around like the better off person down the road instead of commuting on a crowded bus. One lesson I have drawn from history is that sometimes yesterday's solutions become tomorrow's problems. And the car is a good example, because the car's carrying capacity is so inefficient. The more people drive, the worse it is for everyone, including drivers. Conversely, sometimes yesterday's problems become tomorrow's solutions. Dense neighborhoods in industrial cities expose people to overcrowding, disease, pollution. Today, they can be sustainable, vibrant, healthy. We now know more than ever that our ecological footprints depend on the qualities of our built environment. Compact urban spaces integrated into mass transit do not require as many resources. They generate far fewer emissions and pollutants than car-reliant sprawl. By concentrating buildings, infrastructures, and the circulation of people and goods, such spaces are more energy efficient and cost effective. They also free up land elsewhere for ecosystems to thrive. For fauna and flora, paved over land tends to matter more than population density. Looking forward, our planet's welfare largely hinges on how growing cities develop. We know that urbanization is inseparable from ecosystems. In our era, many political movements skeptical about progress have framed cities mainly as problems. When it comes to fossil fuels, a lot of activism has focused on curbing supply through divestment campaigns, for example. Yet, fossil fuel production does not result only from corporate greed. Land use policies incentivizing car-centric sprawl generate demand. We should be in the habit of scrutinizing what gets built, but also what happens when something doesn't get built. Unwittingly, opposition to transit-oriented housing developments can stimulate oil use and particle pollution from tire wear, which heavier electric vehicles worsen. So, by pedestrian futures, I mean planning that enables walking, but also the rather prosaic idea that the cities of tomorrow do not need to be radically different from those of the past. They can resemble the kinds of compact spaces that we largely stopped building. A version of this argument has recently gained steam in some policy circles, but social scientists working on the advantages of agglomeration and economies of scale tend to be attuned to statistics, but not stories, data, but not deities, and efficiencies, but not experience. And this is where urban design is so crucial. In urbanism, many frameworks now begin from the idea that cities and environment are interconnected, moving on from misleading dichotomies between urban and nature. At the same time, those dichotomies still resonate powerfully with people's experiences. The jungle and the concrete jungle feel different. If we consider their footprints quantitatively, denser areas are greener, but we do not perceive them or live them as such. That's a problem if you care about emissions, preservation, or quality of life. This is why planning must account not only for efficiencies, but also for experiences. I took these pictures last month when I visited the landscaped grounds of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation in Pireu, next to Athens. And this is my daughter dressed as Athena. The park was added to an extremely dense neighborhood with little access to green spaces in a former surface lot. In some senses, this was not the most efficient use for that land, but often what is wasteful from a productive logic is what gives life meaning. Not the 15-minute city, but the city of lazy afternoons, the city of idle play. Perhaps the climate movement made a mistake by focusing on the planetary scale as a mobilizer of thought and action. We understand climate change in planetary terms, but humans, as a rule, do not experience the planet as a whole. We experience places. Many of us today inhabit urban places. The urban, unlike the planet, is what we can manage. And planning, in one definition, is the management of change. Change, of course, being the constant in our cosmos. There are also times when our experiences can mislead us. Urban developments might be felt as threats to tradition, belonging, authenticity. Not surprisingly, changing cities invite derision from across the political spectrum. There is a lot that we can find objectionable in legacies of urban planning, but I argue we would do well to revisit the embrace of building for people, plants, critters, birds, in the history of urbanization and the futures in our past. We find the roots of our present predicaments, but we might also search for seedlings, flowers, and fruits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Some really thought-provoking ideas there. I've got a few questions that I'd like to start with, if that's okay. So you talk a lot about looking back to look forwards in terms of how we think of a future city, and particularly the idea of the car-centric development. And you mentioned there the 15-minute city or 15-minute neighborhood, which I think is a very interesting concept of perhaps removing our dependency on the car and thinking about, as Jan Gehl talks about, walkable cities. So, and in a way, that's going back to our idea of medieval or the kind of older historic grain of a city. So Do you think those concepts can transform the contemporary city?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to love in the 15-minute city. Of course, it's not new. It's not that different from the city prior to the modernist separation of functions, right? Prior to the automobile. I do think we probably don't pay enough attention to getting to the cafe in 15 minutes, not just as a consumer, but also as the person that works there. And I think once you sort of introduce those variables from, a modern metropolitan area, then perhaps it's not enough just to think of the scale of the 15-minute city in terms of medieval precedents, right? Sort of the very apprehensible, walkable fabric, because we must imagine that some people will, go to work by taking the train, right? So I do think we need to think of 15 minutes also at the metropolitan and not just the neighborhood scale. In other words, incorporating modern mass transit systems. But I do think that yeah, we would do well to take seriously throughout all of these changes, right? And the book really does sit with the kind of the bewildering experience of being born in a world with carrier pigeons and living to see the telegraph become obsolete, right? So yet through these massive kaleidoscopic changes that humans have been experiencing, at least since the mid 19th century, cities have held their appeal. And a specific kind of city has had a very resilient appeal. And those cities, I think, are not so different from those of the past, right? Cities that are at a human scale that allow us to slow down. So not just speed up communications, not just get places in 15 minutes, but quite the opposite, right? Sort of take stock of what it means to be human, what it means to live among strangers, give time and room for chance encounters, and so on and so forth.
So I suppose that idea of the walkable city, but also using technology, mass transit systems, as you mentioned, it's a kind of combination of the two. We've got a few questions, so I'll kind of frame them for you to consider. So we have a question. Invention seems to have been widely overtaken by innovation in modern cities. So, for example, the new Elizabeth line on the London Underground is still just an underground line. High-speed rail upgrades, and it's still rail. Do you see examples where this isn't the case and real invention is taking place to dramatically change our cities?
Wait, can you repeat the part about what taking place? Sorry, I missed.
So where you see real invention taking place to dramatically change our cities. You did show some examples in the historical images of particularly transport, and we talked about mass rapid transport. But where is that real invention dramatically changing our cities?
Yes, I mean, that's another excellent question. So to try to even connect this to your question, Lorraine, I think an overarching argument here is one that sort of moves us to a more humbler attitude towards the future, and one that recognizes what we can and can't control. And I think that there is a contemporary tendency to think and approach the future and a sense of possibility by focusing on inventions and the need to innovate. And what I would argue is that maintenance is just as important, right? We have many cities where, 19th century inventions are decaying and they could still serve us quite well. So in some senses, just maintaining and updating infrastructure is even more or just as important as innovating. The bicycle was once a transformative, radical invention and innovation. And now many cities, well, since the 1970s oil shocks, many cities in Northern Europe have returned to this old innovation and technology, but not repeating what had been done in the past, but trying to adapt them to the contemporary city where the car has taken over and so on. So this interplay between invention, innovation, and maintenance, I think, is crucial for planning. To me, the great invention innovation that has completely changed our relationship to ourselves, to the future, to the built environment is, of course, the smartphone, right? So I tend to think of smartphones not just as part of the history of media. It's changed how we consume information, but it has in fact changed how we relate to strangers and to our surrounding environments, right? Um, part of what it does is that now someone living in London might have more in common with someone living in Seoul in terms of the music they listen to, the movies they watch, than with someone living in London 80 years ago, right? And this is all extremely new for the human experience. One argument I try to make in the book is that because we carry these, instant access to spaces, a sort of multiplier of spaces in some sense in our phones, cities have gained a value which is, I think, historically fairly new, which is the role of not just speeding us up, as they had done as centers of communication after the telegraph and the train and so on, but in fact, places that can slow us down.
I think one important thing about invention, and you showed those engravings, which they were satirical, but they were also visionary. And I think we can talk about cities. We think of Blade Runner, or we think of really fantastic science fiction idea of cities. But I would suggest that we need those visions in order to imagine our human experience. Could we have imagined the smartphone and how it might have transformed our experience? I think that if you look at Star Trek, you had an imagination we could be transported somewhere. And so these technologies, people need to imagine, because we can invent something, but we then need to think, how is that invention going to transform our experience? So I think how that happens in a contemporary sense, I think, is an interesting idea. How we work with engineers, with writers, with designers to think of experience as well as invention. How do you think we can bring all those ideas together?
Yeah, so I think that the imagination of the future, predictions, fictions, visions, they can loosen our sense of what's possible. And there are many good reasons to engage in those kinds of those kinds of reflections. I mean, they can prepare us for scenarios that are desirable, where these technologies might in directions that we seek, or as antibodies, right? They can prepare us to,
Dystopia.
Yeah, or to regulate, right. I think dystopias can have that role, right? Dystopias can paralyze us, right? I think there's a version of doomstorism where you imagine the future is fixed, and then you sort of foreclose your sense of possibility. But then dystopias can have the opposing role, where they sort of prepare us to face major challenges and hurdles and so on. And I think that might be clearer today than when I wrote the book. That there was something that I kept thinking about as I talked about this project, and this started with an argument that I to some extent still hold on to, that we don't want to repeat the recipe of 19th century, very undemocratic top-down planning, but we do want to maintain their sense of scale and their openness to possibilities, right? We need scales of thought and action that match the scales of our contemporary challenges. But as I sort of was rehearsing this argument through the years, there was often this premise, especially in design circles or art circles, the kinds of circles that some of us move around, that would imagine imagination as sort of a monopoly of progressives, as if only people that desire the things that we desire in the world are doing the imagination. And of course, when you study history, you very quickly learn that fascists, that people that seek the extermination of others and so on, often had very fertile imaginations. And that's something I try to take seriously in the book too, right? So anyway, I think this somewhat answers your question and kind of opens some new lines of thoughts too.
I mean, I think the point you're making as well about strategists and the master planner, I think particularly, I mean, in the UK, we now have community engagement, and there is a requirement to to involve individuals and communities in strategies for local cities and places. And I think what's important about that is not just that individuals can engage in that process, but also they can participate and they can comment, and it's not something that is enforced, but something that is co-designed. So that's quite a shift from how your image of Pompal sort of overlooking, and pointing and being in control. I think that concept is changing, and I think much more democratic approach.
Yeah. Yes, right. So I think scenario planning, participatory processes, they can almost be like muscles, and exercises, even if, of course, people aren't going to always get what they want. They can be sort of great ways to envision what's possible, to try to think through what a place might be, and where people that, experiences the places where a project is happening have, of course, a sense of the place that, a designer and a planner doesn't necessarily have. I do in the book present community engagement as one of the examples potentially of where a solution becomes a problem, right?
Yeah.
There are, of course, all kinds of things we can accomplish with representative democracy that we can't with community engagement because, well, one, who shows up? The other is, as we envision the future, we can't have a seat at the table for newcomers, people that haven't moved to a place just yet, or children, people not yet born, and so on, right? So I think we have to be more imaginative as we think of these processes, as often, does happen, but also. And here I think is part of the answer for kind of the uses of these exercises of reflecting about visions and potential futures. I think they can help us let go of a particular vision of the future, right? I think that's crucial for democracy too. There's a political scientist I admire whose name is escaping me now, who always talks about how a condition for democracy is learning and knowing how to lose, right? And I think that should be part of the attitude as we engage in community processes, right? We might not get what we want, but it's still useful to get a voice there, to maybe even change what we think about what's possible. And then from the perspective of design and planning, I sometimes think of a medical analogy where a good doctor listens very, very closely to a patient to make a diagnosis, to understand the symptoms, but not necessarily for the receita, for the medicine, right? We can't expect people to have technical solutions for their everyday problems. I do think that there's a role there for expertise and for planners to, have a voice too.
Excellent. We've got another couple of questions. So this question, you mentioned the tracing of roots of cities to both negative and positive experiences. What do you feel is one of the more overlooked successful aspects to cities prior to the 21st century?
Oof. Well, I guess it depends on overlooked by who. So, I will say, I started as a cultural historian. My first book is on a neighborhood in Rio, out of which samba, a lot of modern popular genres of Brazilian music came from. And it was almost like paying a debt of gratitude. I just wanted to understand how this beautiful music could have existed in the world. And as I engaged in this project, more and more I understood that there was a lot that was downstream from the city and the built environment, right? And a city that enabled, Afro-Brazilians and Jewish migrants to listen to each other, to play music together, and so on and so forth. So I think that we often underestimate the extent to which things that we attribute to cultural essences, in fact, flow from material conditions that cities enable. I have a project that I would love to do one day in partnership with someone who has the quantitative chops, sort of putting in a graph, rental prices in cities and places that we tend to think of as having undergone great cultural effervescence because I think that almost always a condition of cultural effervescence is housing abundance. When cities build lots of housing, and for whatever reason, people with money don't go there, or there's supply and rents go down, somehow, not magically, but because people have more free time, they seem to make art and create great things. This happened in Harlem in the Harlem Renaissance. This happened in Rio. This happened in Buenos Aires in the early 20th century. So maybe the relationship between rent and culture might be what I think is an overlooked.
I mean, I think the idea of the city as a kind of theatrical stage and spontaneity, because cities are the backdrop for activity, for
Yeah.
interaction. So I think when we look at images of cities over time, we
Mm.
can see that the physical in fabric might look quite similar, but the
Yes.
people, the even in your images you showed, the people, the way they dress, the way they engage with each other, that's something that is reflecting society in some.
Yeah.
So
No, absolutely. That's a wonderful example. It's not the overlooked part of the question is what led me not to go
yeah,
there, since this
yeah,
is, of course, a huge trope in literature for great reasons throughout the
Shakespeare,
19th
yeah,
century, right?
yeah,
Baudelaire, the idea of the city as a platform for
yeah.
chance encounters. I mean, that's just a beautiful and great idea. The way in which it connects to the future is that by being these sort of machines to generate chance encounters, and by being places where we live among strangers, which I think is part of what defines the urban experience. And again, it's something we've naturalized and we now take for granted because we've been doing this for, you know,
Thousands of years.
a few centuries. Right, well, right, yeah. Well, though, most humans for less than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, before cities, that wasn't a given in human experience, right? You lived in tribal environments, you live among people who you knew something about. So cities become places where you can escape roles assigned to you at birth,
Yeah.
based on whatever. And there's something immensely powerful about that.
So this is a good personal question. Someone says, "Thank you for your talk. Out of curiosity, what is your favorite city?"
Ah, oof. I love. There's too many cities that I
You
love.
can only
One
have
day,
one.
well, in the future, it will be York once I make it there
Oh
in
yeah,
person.
come to York, not New York, York. Yeah, yeah.
If it's one, I mean, gosh, there's so many extraordinary cities. I lived in New York, which is an amazing place. Tokyo. I suppose I have to say Rio, which is a city with many problems, but I opened my other book with a reflection on how much I envy those that will be in Rio for the first time, since it's not something I can have
But
having
our
been there.
memories of cities can be about the backdrop, the buildings.
Yeah,
And as an architect, I'm always fascinated by buildings and history and so on. But it can be about people and experience. So our
yeah,
favorite might change over time
yeah.
because of those experiences. We have one more question. So, should or does design and planning take inspiration from fiction, thinking specifically of utopian landscapes?
Yes. Maybe. I mean, another great question. Um, there's a lot on utopian thought in this book. Utopian thought in the earlier half of the 19th century was often about escaping the city. And you sometimes had this fantasy and this fiction that you could really control things from the top down, even if you were escaping authoritarian settings. And there is something dangerous to whatever's remained of utopian imaginations as islands, because cities and humans are never islands, and they must always sort of be open for change. So it depends. I think, to the extent that utopias can expand our sense of the possible and stretch our limits of the thinkable, you know, they're wonderful. But I do think history cautions us against the idea that we can solve a problem once and for all. Going back to the great cities, I think many cities in Northern Europe have some great planning in the last 10, 20 years. Paris, Barcelona, they're all doing wonderful things. And I think the condition for great planning is always openness to change and not falling into the trap that a lot of the authoritarian planners like Pombal and Osman fell into, that you can plan for posterity, whether as a utopian or whether as an authoritarian.
I mean, if you look at somewhere like Barcelona and you look at the Certus grid and how that interacts with the medieval city, that you can literally see the city history literally through experiencing it.
So, and Cerdà, I mean, Cerdà is a protagonist in the book, and precisely for someone who planned for change, who was inspired by utopias, including Kabir.
But there you go.
When he came to design,
yeah,
had a very open-ended sense of the future.
So I think there's time. I'm just checking. Have any more questions? Oh, yes. Have you looked at the addition to the city of Ferrara in the 1400s, built on the grid pattern inspired by Roman ideas?
Yes. So there's several of those from the early modern world. So one thing that I trace in the book is this late medieval, early modern equivalence between moral rectitude and geometric rectitude. And I borrow those terms from the art historian Samuel Edgerton, which very much fueled early imaginations of what the future should look like, right? The future in the 18th century and through much of the 19th was very much imagined as a straight line and a grid. So it wasn't just New York's case, they sort of phoned it in because they ran out of time, but there's a reason why the grid reappears. And this was about rationality, practicality, but it was also about this deeply embedded sense of moral rectitude as geometric. So Ferrara is mentioned among others from the period. So thank you for that question too.
And I have a question actually. So when you stop,
by the way, a city which has returned to bikes only early for European standards, but a city that also embraces new futures.
New futures with the bicycle, reinventing the wheel, literally. So in the book, you talk about the apocalypse in 1755 in Lisbon, and that disaster sort of broke the city away from medieval constraints and invented a kind of modern planning. And the big disaster we're facing and challenge today is climate change. So do you think that cities have the will to reinvent themselves for climate resilience, or is there some catastrophic kind of crisis that will force that systemic change?
Yeah. So, if we simply built the kinds of cities that people clearly desire based on real estate prices, right? Walkable, compact centers, that would have a transformative impact on our ecological footprints and on emissions, right? So if we simply did that, you do not have to become an environmentalist. You're helping to save the planet simply by moving to an apartment and not driving around everywhere, right? So that's really very low-hanging fruit. We don't need a disaster to begin doing that. We can simply go off and do it near transit. You can allow apartments to be built, and that does quite a bit. But again, if you allow people to live in apartments, they're not going to be living in sprawl. That's good for the birds and butterflies too. I think what cities lack, are the tools. I think that's a major problem that we've been that is, I think, actually wildly under-discussed. We've inherited in most of the world jurisdictions and scales of governance from periods that preceded the metropolitan scale of cities. So city halls throughout the world don't have enough tools to govern their metropolitan areas. I live in a city where about 15% of the population is within the main core municipality. The others are in surrounding municipalities. So you simply lack the tool, I think, to tackle the scale of climate change. So I do think, we would do well to, again, recover the 19th century openness to think of governance at other scales and annex or create, structures that allow for planning and funding of mass transit, not just within a city, but at a larger metropolitan scale and so on. And there are, of course, places that do that much better than others, China and Germany, for example.
And we have a last question before I'll draw a conclusion. So, how important are individual visually engaging architectural pieces in the forming of a city?
Individual
visually engaging architectural pieces.
I mean,
As an architect, I'd say they're the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely. There is something I've been thinking about, which I think that they're so important that in contemporary world, sometimes the actual representation matters more than the place. In other words, what makes investments flow and approvals and so on and so forth are the renderings of what a place ought to be like. So sometimes you get designs and you get plans. There's a park in Copenhagen that I've written about along these lines where it looks great in photographs and they're so arresting and appealing that this becomes a prized place and so on. But the materials age poorly, right? The landscaping doesn't account for climate and so on and so forth. So I'd say very important, sometimes too important. So there is a risk of,
it's all part of the big plan. Well, I think we're going to draw to a conclusion there, but I'd like to finish by saying, Bruno, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking conversation and also some questions. So thank you as well to the audience for putting forward the questions. Thanks for attending today's event, to the audience as well. Please look at what's happening in the festival program. There are many other events happening in the coming days and the week. And finally, if you want to purchase a copy of Bruno's book, The Invention of the Future, A History of Cities in the Modern World, copies will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, foxlanebooks.co.uk. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and thank you all. Much appreciated.